A knock on the door, tentative but plainly sounded. Severus Snape looked up, pausing mid-annotation on the application form. The 18th application form, that he had read that night. References for those applying for ministerial internships in Britain and Europe would have to wait. At 2:30 in the morning whoever was knocking needed his full attention. Enter. As he'd surmised. He had invited Septimus Lupin of course, and the boy was here, late at night, with something on his mind. Septimus looked uneasy as he walked towards the headmaster's desk. He had gone to bed early, much to Julian's disgust, abandoning a game of bottom trumps as his friend tutted, coughed, complained that his sore throat and aching limbs had returned, and said good night from his bed in the busy hospital wing as he waited for Madame Pomfrey to get to him with that evening's medicine. Septimus had then tossed and turned in the darkness in the Gryffindor dormitory, his head pounding and his skin prickling as if something was trying to get out from under it. He couldn't sleep, worry kept him from rest. Not the astronomy test the next morning, or the fact that he had heard, as he had made his way to Professor Snape's office, Fraser Blewit's discussion with other students on the corridor that afternoon about his chance at a job with the ministry and how his father had got him in with the president. That was probably what was worrying him. Septimus told himself, that someone like Fraser Blewit, an older student, who was very influential, his father had caused Septimus's father, and Sirius Black too. Septimus? Snape prompted the question he knew the boy was about to ask, bringing him from his thoughts to the reason why he was there. I want to go to see Dad. Septimus hadn't meant to blurt it out, and he looked around nervously, hoping that his directness wasn't out of turn. The silence continued and Septimus began to feel nervousness rise again. His head pounding and the sickness in his stomach begin to rise as the wizard looked at him. The longer he stood in front of Snape the worse he felt. Eventually, he opened his mouth to ask again, his time a little more politely, when the headmaster of Hedgewoods shuffled the papers he was holding and put down his quill before folding his fingers together. It is late, or, rather, early, at nearly 2:45. Please, sir. Septimus ignored the desperation in his own voice. You did say to come at any time. Indeed I did. Snape beckoned towards him. At least the boy had not asked about his mother, he supposed. He rose and began to walk slowly towards Septimus, peering at him momentarily. Would you like to go now? Septimus inhaled, and then breathed back out. Yes. Yes, he did. He nodded. Yes, sir. And when we return, you'll go to bed and get some rest immediately? You don't look well. No, sir. It was true, despite not having much rest and worrying about Dad, he'd felt restless and lethargic the night before too. Once I've seen Dad, I'm sure I'll feel better. Snape nodded. Indeed, and how will your constitution feel after flying to St. Mungo's? Septimus had never flown outside the castle grounds before. His lightning shot, while outstanding, was, nevertheless, currently redundant while not playing Quidditch. Besides, flying on a proper wizard's broom was something else, he knew. And he was not to be disappointed. The dark night enveloped them as they exited a small door just underneath the previous headmaster's portraits, hitherto non-existent, which led to a narrow strip of steps which clung to the outer wall of the tower. Septimus caught his breath and looked upwards as the hem of the headmaster's robe rose higher. When he'd caught up with the wizard, and wondering how he'd had the nerve to climb the steps that were so precariously placed, Septimus felt his eyes widen in the blackness. There, hovering 2 feet above the ground, was a broom. And not just any broom. If it were a motorbike it would be Harley-Davidson Toucan. If a violin, then a Stradivarius. If it had been a guitar, a Fender Mim Stratocaster. Made in the 15th century, a broom of immeasurable myth. Reputed to be non-existing in the entire world, Septimus stared as the green phosphorescent glow that made the broom's pedigree beyond doubt. Severus Snape's broom was a broadclad, a broom of such repute, 5 known never to have existed and manufactured by the wizard who, up until recently, owned the Firebolt Broomstick Company, and who had thrown in their lot to invest in Pensieves, from whom Septimus's mother had purchased the lightning shot 999. Broadclads were made from oaks felled from 5 oaks, a magical site just outside modern-day Reading, planted by the great wizard Hengist himself upon his accession to the Wizengamot as great high wizard, hardened in over 100 years of harsh medieval winters where the wood hardened and thickened. Had it not been right before his eyes, this legendary war horse, whose legend was without measure, Septimus would not have believed it, as it was reputed there were none left in existence. Septimus stared. These were the brooms that changed battle into game, or, rather, battle into battle limited by Quidditch rings, bludgers, quaffles and snitches. His father had explained, large and heavy the broadclad was the one most sought for its might and stealth. Grip the handle, instructed Snape, halting Septimus's recall of the history of all things Quidditchly, then climb on. It shouldn't fly off without me. Nervously, and trying to forget the word shouldn't, Septimus mounted the broom. He could feel the huge weight of the thing under his hand and his nerve held just to the point that the headmaster got astride too and he could grip his robes. Up. Snape leaned forward and gripped the end of the broom, putting all of his shoulders and chest into a deep push down. The force was tremendous. Had Septimus not thought to hold tighter he would have been thrust backwards off the thing, and it rose like a huge animal unleashed from a cage. They began to spiral clockwise, the luminescent trail swirling below, and then, with a swiftness which belayed its vastness, the broom shot into the sky. Before Septimus knew they were shooting through the dark, starlit sky, their iridescent wake shedding behind them. Below, through the greenness emanating behind them, patches of light that he could only think must be tiny Scottish villages such as Hogsmeade, but it wasn't until there was a glow beneath them that Septimus realized, such the acceleration of the thing had been. He had his eyes clamped tightly shut, for the glow was London, the Thames outline picked out in lights, with the Wheel and the Houses of Parliament just behind. It took less than 5 minutes for Snape to land on the roof of the Wizard Hospital and, with a pair of quivery legs, Septimus dismounted, his legs enveloped momentarily by a puff of green gaseousness, illuminated by the full moon's light. Shivering, and with one backwards glance, and a fleeting realization that he'd just flown on a piece of history, Septimus followed Severus Snape down the steps from the roof and into the hospital. 88,888,888. It's heartbreaking to see. Bathsheba Bradle rotated her index finger as the spoon in her tea slowly stirred as she watched Septimus Lupin carefully pick up his father's limp hand. Snape looked at her and nodded. I wonder if there is any hope. Of course there's hope. Snape nodded towards the bubble-like window that he had created from the sitting room of Grimmauld Place, the light and airy reciprocator headquarters. He had suggested the one-way link to the boy and he'd agreed to walk towards the door to indicate when he was ready to leave. Indeed, replied Bathsheba quickly. How goes the potion, Severus? Several pairs of eyes were on him now, including Benjamin Wurgs, Sturgis Podmore, the Potters and Molly Weasley. It was a kind of impromptu meeting involving whoever was around, but the most important was time, not just for Septimus and Remus, but also for Snape to observe. Slowly. That is to say, methodically slow. Both of our dear friends are in a critical state, Sirius less so. His blood pressure is high, a result of my medication, and it should drop with time. Which is why he is tired, as you've observed, Molly, when you've gone to visit him. He looked towards Molly Weasley, who nodded in confirmation. He too is concerned I am not doing enough for Remus. And I know he has asked you, James, for some work to be getting on with. I gave him the transcripts of the European Council meetings involving Hermione Granger, Robert Penwright, Vincenzo and Draco Malfoy that we shouldn't have in our possession whatsoever at all. James arched his eyebrow and the corner of his mouth curled a little, all 300 pages of them. He knows, I told him about Henrietta. James continued quickly, anticipating the question. It came as something of a shock. And, for once, he was quite happy to do some of this. Merlin knows we need the time in the field for these growing conjurist attacks. Murmurs of agreement followed from there, number reduced, reciprocators. However, if I do not succeed with something for Remus, if nothing is done soon, Snape cast a look round the room getting back to the original point, his organs will fail and he will die. He felt the panic around him rather than hear or see it. Bathsheba had stopped stirring her tea, Benjamin had frozen as if cursed by petrificus totalis. Molly gripped her husband's hand and James leaned forward towards Lily, who did utter a noise, like a mouse being squashed by a lead door. Her face was etched with concern and urgency. Snape answered her unspoken questions. I am best placed, of course. You've said it yourself, Lily. He looked at her and her face grew more urgent. You've told me before that if I could devise a potion to help Remus then I can do it now, and I can. It's whether he'll still be alive for it to be of any use to him. And Septimus? We're hearing a lot of young wizards at Hedgewoods are getting ill, Severus. It was Bathsheba's turn to look worried. Her little features stood proud of her round, squashy face and her eyebrows knitted. We cannot be having this for our young people, she added, in her melodious Welsh voice. Snape looked away from the scene on the basement ward of St. Mungo's, at Septimus Lupin stroking his father's hand as a nurse changed his catheter and nodded his head silently in acknowledgement. He has been under the weather, it is true, but I do feel that will pass. He is concerned with his father, and that of a friend of his who is also ill. Yes, there are some of the students who appear to have come down with some sort of illness. It is still September, of course. Bug month, interpreted James, who was still holding Lily's shoulder and stroking it gently as she stared towards the portal, at Septimus, who seemed to be talking to his father now, as a nurse came to take Remus's pulse. Indeed. Snape glanced at his colleague. Children arriving at schools from all over the country, and indeed, this year, from non-wizard institutions too. Infections of all kinds spread themselves around and mutate through a new crop of less robust immune systems. It's too early to see if there's a pattern, however. Sturgis Podmore, who had been otherwise engaged leafing through some parchments on the table behind the Potters, looked up. Are you sure? What does Cleus say? The pause that followed was not only pregnant, it was full term, with twins. Cleus has been otherwise engaged with the council, said Snape eventually. I have of course, sent him a message, he is aware of the situation. The council. Severus Snape knew that his co-head of the reciprocators, despite being such, was wedded to the government of the country. He could see it now. The Mullins, their feet up on the table, taking in the briefing in a laissez-faire manner in the hope of winding up Mr. Lupin Sr., Peaceable Furnace scribbling notes and dispatching others via post-imps for immediate action from junior staff members of his department, while Anaxagoras looked over his shoulder and made his own notes. Jane Jones would be peering over her spectacles waiting for any slight inconsistency that may pass Cleus's lips, pursing her own and requesting clarification. Herbert interrupting every now and then to give his own bitter appraisal of the situation. A smile curled at Snape's lip at the thought of Cleus's silent frustration at the Minister for Defense. The Lestranges ignoring all around them, but taking in every word. It's just getting so terrible, sighed Lily, nodding her head. These attacks. She cast her eyes back towards the scene in the hospital. Septimus was holding Remus's hand and talking to him softly about school, and getting to the hospital by Broadclad. Do we have any news about Tabitha? All eyes returned to Snape. There was a pause. Sturgis, as the cousin of the Penwrights, had been against Tabitha Penwright undertaking work behind the veil, not least because Snape had had a hand in it. Not that he disliked the wizard, every one of the reciprocators knew that he respected Severus Snape's ability and talent, but that his cousin had been so closely connected to him, that they had been engaged and called it off. Despite her insistence it had been her doing. Breen came 2 nights ago with inquiries about an update from Robert. He qualified. Tabitha. The thought of her had passed through Snape's mind earlier that evening, when Cleus had briefed him too on that which he had shared with the council, namely the positions over the last few hours of the sporadic and apparently random attacks on non-magic persons, the length and breadth of the country, names of suspects, and the increase in errors in monitoring the situation that night. While listening to Cleus's report, perfectly delivered as it was, and would be later to the council, he could not put the Mysteria out of his mind. What would she think about the events? Goblins shoring up money, people, wizards with tentative links to conjurists wanting equality for magical creatures, the submission of a formal proposal to further expand on the experiment that had seen the introduction of magical creatures into Britain from Strasbourg, in both widening the range of beasts and length of time over which it is carried out. Tomorrow night would be when the reciprocators would hear it from Cleus. Nothing more. Snape shook his head, glancing momentarily to Sturgis and holding his gaze. She is doing her work, Sturgis, said James wearily. Tabitha even came here to tell us, in that enthusiastic manner of hers. Bathsheba Bradle grinned, nodding too. Would you have her doing anything other than what she lives to do? She waited, and watched the wizard pause, before shaking his head briefly. Besides, continued Bathsheba, changing the subject, her jovial manner giving way to severe sobriety. Whatever Cleus tells us tomorrow, we're far too thinly spread as it is. All we've been doing is papering over the cracks, interjected Benjamin Wurgs, shaking his head, the matter one which he had raised time after time for several months. We are supporting the ministry to the best of our ability, but for how long? We're stretched so thin, trying to smooth the community divisions across the country, between wizards and non-wizards. How long will it continue is a question we'd all like to know the answer to, interjected Sturgis solemnly, shaking his head. I mean, we all have a right to some idea about what the ministry's intentions are. Ben's right, we can't be expected to keep this up indefinitely. Till Walpurgis night, Snape muttered, turning his head towards the view at St. Mungo's. Huh. Well, you didn't have to be so damned flippant, Snape, protested Sturgis, folding his arms crossly. You might as well have asked how long a piece of string. What? Arthur Weasley's brow creased as he tried to understand what the headmaster of Hedgewoods and Sturgis Bodmore were saying. It had indeed been a long night. Several long nights, with long days in between. He doesn't know how long, dear, sighed Molly Weasley, placing a hand softly on her husband's shoulder. You know. Twice the distance from middle to end, said Benjamin, his frustration giving way to mischief. Unless you mean the real Walpurgis Nigged, that some European witch festival? Bathsheba nudged him, nearly making him spill his tea, and whispered, Nerd. I am merely repeating Cleus's words, explained Snape, his attention now back with the reciprocators, and yes, my apologies Sturgis, if you thought I was being flippant. Indeed, I do not believe the ministry does know. Perhaps it's a question you may wish to put to him yourself tomorrow night? Tomorrow? Sturgis's brow creased as he sought for memories that he knew were there, somewhere, if only he knew where. Tomorrow. The meeting, to be briefed on the ministry's progress, Snape explained slowly. Yes. Of course. Sturgis looked abashed. My turn to apologize, Snape. None needed. Now, If you'll all excuse me, I think there's a boy who I need to return to Hedgewoods before the night is over." "I was about to say," said Lily, dragging her eyes away from the scene too. "Oh, I do hope it's managed to make him feel better, Severus," she added as the wizard walked over to the image, holding aloft his wand before making the hospital ward. Remus Lupin and his son shrink to a thin wisp of light and feeding itself into the tip. "We'll be seeing you tomorrow night then?" Snape nodded. "And is there any news about the ministry post? For Sam, I mean?" Lily put a hand on Snape's sleeve. "I know you can't discuss it, really." Snape looked at her, his brow furrowing. "For the sake of equity I will not say whether he has a better chance or that he hasn't. He has represented himself well and I have put my best case on his behalf." Snape put his other hand over hers and patted it. "He has a strong case, Lily, and he is up against 3 others for the only British place." Lily craned her neck to look at James, who smiled at his wife. "You mustn't pester Severus, Lily. He's doing his best." James looked at Snape and mouthed the word sorry. "Everyone's done the best they can." Lily's beseeching expression gave way to comprehension. She nodded, before glancing back at the place where the image portal had been. "His work experience will go in his favor," James continued. "Undoubtedly," agreed Snape, before adding, "Now I really must be getting along. I have a young man who is no doubt keen on taking to the skies on the Broadclad." On the back of said broomstick Septimus began to go over the visit to his father again. It was good that Snape had left him. He felt grown up, although not in an altogether privileged way that sometimes feeling grown up felt like. It was more like being weighted down by something, as if learning and having fun was just a brief memory. Now, accelerating into the night, as a pinkish glow in the east began to underline the blanket of stars, Septimus felt that he wasn't ready to feel like that at all. Next time, he'd ask Snape to stay. It wasn't like there was anything he wanted to tell Dad that he didn't mind the headmaster hearing. It was what he'd wanted to tell his dad as he'd sat by his bedside, that all would be okay, that Mum would be with them and they would all be together again as a family, which felt particularly burdensome. Since he couldn't be sure of any of that, he'd instead just reached towards his father's ashen hand, limp and clammy as he lay there, unmoving, and told him quietly that he loved him before waiting there quietly, telling him some things he'd done and how he felt at school, and not feeling at all silly, as he'd imagined he would feel, before Snape had ushered him away. A healer had come to tend him just as Septimus was leaving, wiping his brow before unhooking the intravenous drip, and a pang of agony penetrated his stomach. He wished he could stay longer, he wished there was something he could do. He wished Mum was around too, she would make him feel better, she always did. And he imagined her working away on some chemical experiment which would turn out to be a potion for Dad, doing what she could for him, however remote the chance that it would actually work. Mum never gave up hope, and, as Snape led him to the thick oak doors that marked the end of the hospital ward and the stairwell between floors, he wished, as he looked at the empty bed where the now well Sirius Black had lain, he could have said the same of himself. Snape delivered him back to the door of the Gryffindor or common room. He had said very little to Septimus but now turned to him and lowered his head. "Anytime you wish to visit your father, you know where to find me." Septimus nodded. How strange, he thought as he felt himself nodding, that he was standing here in the strange autumn morning half-light. He had been delivered back to school by his headmaster, having visited his very old dad, rather than, like a lot of students who would be getting up in a couple of hours, not giving their families a second thought as they got up, breakfasted, chatted to friends, thought up an excuse as to why they hadn't done their homework for their first lesson. He yawned, shielding his mouth with his hand. "Yes, sir," Septimus nodded again, feeling the exhilaration of their journey home, with the dawn hinting on its appearance to their right as they charged north on Snape's ancient, magnificent broom. "I will explain your absence to Professor X. You must use your time to rest, Septimus. he added, a tone in his voice reminding Septimus of the time Snape had found him reading the story that never was in Grimmauld Place's library, and he found himself nodding fervently. Snape watched him go, standing by the common room door as the frame of the fat lady's portrait swung back into position. He stared at it a little longer, thinking a thought about Septimus's heritage once again and wondering whether a morning off was enough. He was Remus Lupin's son, after all, before turning and making his way down the steps towards the grand staircase and out of the castle into the early morning dawn. Septimus had written to Cecilia, responding to the letter she had written to him, flawed as it had been and infused with emotion. His instinct had been to ask her about her evidence for what constituted non-wizards in a wizard environment, but, knowing that she wouldn't take it well, had merely asked her scientific interpretation for her findings. He had surmised himself, of course, that non-wizards would be receiving magical energy and a measure of power, and channeling it. Cecilia thought she could do magic and, if she thought about it rationally, which she was, of course, more than capable of analyzing the situation for herself without having to seek the reassurance of her former work colleague. As long as she didn't let her emotions rule her. He must not antagonize her, much as he wished to engage in debate, for to marginalize her and isolate her would be something he knew he would regret. But there was something which had occurred to him as they had traveled back to Hedgewoods, which is why he was making his way at 5 o'clock in the morning such that it was to the school greenhouses. 88,888,888. Tired? Septimus, making his way across the carpet, stopped in his haze of drowsiness. Yep. He turned. Late night? Rufus Lestrange, his dark hair bouncing around his face as he grinned at Septimus. Late early morning. Want to play bottom trumps? No thanks, Ruf. Okay then. Rufus turned back towards the book he was reading, nodding his head as if listening to music as he opened it. That was the thing about Rufus Lestrange, he never asked for explanations, he just accepted people as they were. He didn't expect Septimus to justify why he wasn't in bed. Ruf? Yes? Septimus yawned, knowing Julian wouldn't be really up to a visit from the young Lestrange boy, but never mind. Would you like to come later to see Julian? We can all play bottom trumps then? Ace. Rufus half nodded towards him, sticking up a thumb and grinning beneath his curly locks. Ace, thought Septimus to himself. Who said that anymore? And who accompanied by a thumbs up. It was beyond bizarre. It was. Septimus made his way up the steps and put his hand on the dormitory doorknob. It was uniquely. There was his bed, oh how blissful to sink into it, for his weariness to melt away. He flopped onto it. Uniquely. Septimus closed his eyes, fleeting images of the broad-clad Snape, his dad, the dawn rising, the absence of his mum, sent Mungos filling his head. Uniquely Rufus. 88,888,888. The letters in Snape's cloak had not been lost on his journey with Septimus. Uncharacteristically he checked, making sure the post, that had arrived shortly before Septimus, had not inadvertently fluttered down to earth like confetti as they'd flown, not least because he would have some explaining to do to the European Council as to why the exchange of information from Hedgewoods to the European schools was somewhat one-sided so far. Neville Longbottom was tending a tendril of what turned out to be a shepherd's purse plant, or, as Neville explained, Capsula bursta pastoris, as the tiny heart-shaped pods containing the seeds of the plants affected the name. Or where they should be, he explained, pocketing his letter without a second glance, gently lowering the leaf stalk studded with the tiny capsules as if it was the arm of a most adored lover. Snape leaned in, looking at the tiny dots glinting in the early morning sun. Tell me, Snape cleared his throat. As I understand it, and of course you know Professor Longbottom, that my knowledge of the botanical world, magical or otherwise, is somewhat dwarfed by your own. The small pods, The purses pop to distribute the plant's seeds. A pressure build-up? Like pea plants? Pissum sativum, nodded Neville, making no comment as to his knowledge or that of Snape's. Similar. Peas are of the family Fabaceae legumes, of course, the shepherd's purse of Brassicaceae. But in principle, yes. Neville bent his head lower, scooping up a branchlet and holding it towards the headmaster. Snape peered lower. It appeared that some of the pods were glittering. Do you know why this plant is so perfect? Neville looked at the plant lovingly, running his hand up the stem. Genetically, the variety of genes that are expressed is vast. He looked at Snape. Were it to be human, Snape, you would be keen on investigating its potential with regard to potions research. Neville Longbottom looked back to the plant. But, from my point of view, there is so much more scope with plants. Why do the seeds glint? And why is some part of it white? Disease? Neville glanced down at another branchlet before turning to Snape. Well, that is a question, isn't it? The main question about this plant in particular. His tone suggested that Snape was in on the humor or the irony, and Snape smiled patiently. If you would indulge me, Professor Longbottom. Well, Neville held out a small section of the wildflower weed. You see here? No glinting. Snape looked down, narrowing his eyes as he scrutinized the small triangular pod. And here? The other pod seemed to shimmer. Neville crushed it in his hand, and the other too, revealing tiny glitter-like dots within the latter. My usual samples of shepherd's purse, ones I usually work with, are of magical strain. As I said, the range of genes is diverse, so it is versatile. But this plant is one which is a normal plant, that is to say a randomly selected example of a non-magical burst pastorus. It is growing glittery seeds dash. Money for the purses. Interjected Neville, laughing. Indeed, nodded Snape patiently, but it is also dying. He waited for Neville Longbottom to finish laughing at his own observation of the magical seeds being actually made of gold to fit in the purses, and the herbology professor regained his composure and nodded in agreement. This plant is attempting to emulate the magical variety, but it only did that when I planted it in their vicinity. Symbiosis? No, they live independently. They are called companion plants, and some beneficial effects from each taking a useful property of the other go in their favor, evolutionally speaking. So, for example, when the wizard children burst the pods to find the gold to spend, shaking the rest on the floor as they go, they assist in seed distribution. The non-magical variety benefit from emulating this. The magical variety benefit from not being totally wiped out from over-enthusiastic children. But, the interesting thing, continued Neville, pacing around the greenhouse and examining another plant, the effect remains for a time, even when the magical plant is pulled up. Fascinating, agreed Snape. They seem to have some sort of vibrational signature, which changes when they are in contact with one another. I've been thinking, what do you think, Severus? He stared up sharply at Snape and stared at him. The Sorting Hat, do you consider that people have a similar vibrational interaction with their environment? The botanical one is well documented, but I have yet to find substantial evidence in current research for a transferable effect in wizards or non-wizards. Because if there was, and it was altered, this is perhaps why the Sorting Hat refused to sort some of the pupils. Perhaps on a molecular level, it did not, or could not, or would not detect them. Neville left the question hanging and continued with his tending of his plants, making sure the Venus flytraps did not take the tips of his fingers with their dipteral breakfast. Or it could have just been being grumpy, said Snape, half to himself. His herbology professor had given him a lot to think about, but, before he left the greenhouse, he proposed one other question to Neville Longbottom. How do you feel about wizards and non-wizards in comparison to plants, I mean? As I said, it's not much different with plants. even for non-wizards. They seem to be enjoying it, settling in here, especially those who seem to be able to do magic. Seem? What do you mean, seem? There was a long pause, only the sound of pouring water could be heard. Neville watering the yuccas, big-leaved varieties of yucca plants that licked you if you got too close and covered you with sticky slime. Well, why I love these Burster pastoris plants so much, is that they are the exception, rather than the rule. Their seeds really do turn into gold, and their frailty as a result is limited. Most non-magical varieties do not survive. They display several of the significant qualities of their counterparts but, as a result, barely last any time at all. It's as if the magic is concentrated into something brilliant for them, but the cost is their health, and ultimately their lives. Neville looked up from filling up his watering can from the rain butt at the door entrance. It is theoretical, but I do hope Professor Hop from Xpatons has sent me some results from her experiments. He tapped his robe where he had slipped in the letter that Snape had given to him. It would seem that, should a lot of these plants be removed before the critical time that she calls X, the non-magical plants make a complete recovery. After. Neville shook his head sadly before looking up quickly, uncertainty etched on his face. I do apologize, Headmaster. Here you are, coming to deliver the post, and there I am, going on. No indeed, Snape countered. As with all of your work, it is most fascinating, Neville. And to himself added, most fascinating. Now, perhaps, might be the right time to allow the students to remain on the right side of X. 88,888,888. The veil, deep in the Department of Mysteries, in its physical form, forced itself to bunch all its energy together. The material out of which its interface between its inner being and the world, moved slightly. A sudden breeze could have done better. But it was there, it knew. It existed now. And, though the experiment was at best weak and pathetic, nevertheless it had caused something to happen. Someone was trespassing. Something had to be done. If its feelings could be described, something not too dissimilar to annoyance would be the adjective. Someone had tried to control it before. It had resisted. It would resist again.